Welcome back, everyone. That was a short break, but hopefully you were able to get a little bit of refreshment. I'm just going to give it a moment or two more just for everyone to rejoin us, and I'm sure we'll be joined by further people this afternoon. So what I like to do, because you had your cameras on and you were unmuted during the breakouts, is if you can turn cameras off and mute yourself unless you are speaking during this afternoon session. I went into one of the breakout rooms, had a fascinating conversation. We hope that you also found other people brave enough to unmute and put their cameras on so you could begin to have a conversation, because sometimes it's through the unlikely encounters with people we've never met before that we see the possibility of new conversations. So our session this afternoon, the first really meaty session in terms of delving into some of the issues, is around awareness building and advocacy. And it's our global pledge to leave no one behind. The Sustainable Development Goals were very much about saying this isn't just about front runners, pace setters. This is about an agenda for everyone. And particularly interested in this session to focus on how we bring frontline communities into the conversation to ensure that they're heard and respected, and how that can be delivered within a responsible sourcing framework. So important. We've got a keynote speaker, and then we're going to open up a panel discussion and give you the opportunity to contribute as well. But right at the outset, what I'd like to do is to introduce our keynote speaker. And I'm hoping he is online. Mark Dummett, are you there and are you with us?
I am, Peter. Hi.
Brilliant. Hi there. Fantastic. So, Mark, you're Director of Global Issues Program at Amnesty International. And I know you're very much involved in focusing on issues around human rights violations in international supply chains. And I think particularly looking around cobalt and battery supply chains, also issues around oil exploitation in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. So you come with a lot of experience. And there's always a danger with this type of conference that we're feeling, oh, we seem to have pathways forward and are doing things, but we always need to feel that salutary understanding that real lives are being affected right around the planet the whole time. And I think you're just the person to help build some of that picture for us, but maybe some also of the seeds of engagement with local communities that responsible sourcing will be about. So Mark, if you unmute, and then over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thanks a lot for that. I hope I'm not going to bring you down too much. But it's true. I think in my presentation, I think I'm going to be outlining, the challenges, I think, in or some of the challenges that I've encountered through my work and the work that Amnesty has done in making sure that frontline communities and workers' voices are heard. I have some slides, but we don't need to put any on yet. Look, I think first of all, I want to thank you for holding this important event. I think it's great that it's happening despite. Can you hear me? Oh yeah. I think it's great that it's happening despite the pandemic. These issues aren't going away. The issue that we're discussing today is as Peter said, the challenge that those affected by the human rights and environmental impacts of business operations face in having their voices heard and their concerns addressed. And I think we can all appreciate just what an enormous challenge this is. their voices, sadly, are often overlooked by powerful interests, whether that's businesses or governments. And, you know, this fact is driving human rights abuses and environmental catastrophe. And frankly, there are no easy ways of fixing this, but it's clearly something that we do need to prioritize. And when I say we, I mean everyone, human rights organizations, businesses, governments, and of course, everyone involved. So anyway, I'm really grateful that we've been asked to discuss this, because so much of the time when we talk about responsible sourcing or business and human rights more broadly, the interests and voices of affected communities are seldom center stage. And instead, I think we focus so much in our discussions on what businesses themselves should or shouldn't be doing, which of course is key, and that's what we're trying to influence. But it's so important to begin with this understanding, to the best extent that we can, of the experience of those with the least amount of power, those same people who have the most to lose from irresponsible business practice, people living thousands of miles away from the headquarters of multinational mining corporations, or the companies that manufacture and sell goods containing minerals to consumers around the world, but who live right next to those mines where the minerals are extracted, and who are therefore the most exposed to harm. You know, I've been asked to speak specifically about communities, workers and activists impacted by mining operations. But first of all, I want to give a bit of background to Amnesty International's work on corporate accountability more broadly, and how this has evolved. And I think, you know, this is helpful for this discussion. We've had a dedicated business and human rights team of researchers and campaigners for around 15 years. And for most of this time, our focus has been on cases where business operations had or are having a direct impact on people's lives. So, for example, probably the first case we looked at was the Bhopal disaster, where in 1984, I'm sure you all know, poisonous gas leaked out of a plant in the middle of the city, which was operated by the US firm Union Carbide, killing up to 10,000 people and harming many more. Another sort of ongoing case that we've been working on is the ongoing tragedy of the Niger Delta, where for decades now, spills from oil pipelines operated by Shell, Europe's richest company, devastate the land and waterways that the communities there rely on for their livelihoods. Now, in both these cases, and as well as others that we looked at, the identity of the business entity involved was well known to everyone, including the affected communities, even if the nature of that involvement or their responsibility is disputed, as it is very much so in the case of Shell and its pipelines. But even in these cases, where those business entities were known and where there's that very close proximity, the victims of these environmental and human rights catastrophes have found it very, very hard to have their concerns addressed and to access remedy, whether that's in the form of medical treatment, in the case of Bhopal, for the survivors of Bhopal to get, you know, adequate and ongoing medical treatment. In the Niger Delta, communities have really struggled to get environmental cleanup, the oil spills cleaned up, essentially. In both cases, people have struggled to get adequate compensation or legal accountability, either in the states where the harm occurred or in the states where the corporations are headquartered. Now, as well as continuing our work, focusing on those cases and others, likewise, or similar cases, we've also expanded our scope, as I think, you know, many other organizations and also importantly, the media has, to draw our attention or bring our attention to the role that companies along the length of supply chains play. In other words, looking at the role of businesses that didn't necessarily cause the harm, but are still linked to it by virtue of their business relationships. And here too, you know, obviously we've found huge power imbalances. And, you know, when we do look at, and when we have looked at cases involving long supply chains, it can be even harder for communities or workers to be heard or have their rights respected. The picture in front of you is, I'm sure you can all recognize, it's the Rana Plaza building in Savar, Bangladesh, a suburb of Dhaka, the capital. And it used to house 5 garment factories supplying clients around the world. Now, on April the 23rd, 2013, large cracks appeared in the walls of the building, and a government inspector ordered it to be evacuated. The next day, however, factory managers, under pressure to complete orders, persuaded, and in some cases they made threats, forcing their workers to return to work. Now, just before 9 a.m., there was a power cut. The managers turned on the building's generators, and the subsequent vibrations then led to the collapse of the entire structure. It's a story we're all familiar with. More than 1,100 people were killed. Over 2,000 were grievously injured. Now, in my mind, the Rana Plaza isn't just a story of fast fashion and how the industry based in rich countries puts its supplies in Bangladesh and other poor countries under massive pressure to produce quickly and at low cost. It isn't only a story, or also only a story of how Bangladesh fails to enforce its own regulations and how its factory owners, many of whom are MPs, are politically very influential and escape accountability there. It's also, very much so a story of how powerless its workers are. Now, before I joined Amnesty, I worked as a journalist and human rights researcher in Bangladesh. And during this time, I interviewed many union organizers, most of whom are women, who try to form unions in factories to increase these vital protections for their fellow garment workers. And now they do so at huge risk to themselves. They could lose their jobs and be blacklisted, and many are, meaning they can't get jobs in other factories. They often receive threats. I've spoken to many who've been beaten up. I know as well, there are some well-known cases of union organizers as well being murdered. Now, the factory owners at the same time used to complain to me that these union organizers were only self-interested and wanted more money for themselves. But the ones who I met said that they repeatedly turned down these bribes and promotions from their bosses in order to continue their activities. But, aside from these individual stories of courage, what struck me the most during this work was just this extraordinary and absolute sort of disconnect between the workers and their lives and their concerns and what was going on in these factories, and then the brands that they and their factories supplied. Yes, the brands employed third-party auditors to visit the factories and check boxes, but pre-Rana Plaza, there just seemed to be very, very little meaningful interaction between these two ends of the supply chain. There was just no dialogue. The brands were benefiting from the labor of the garment workers, but they took little meaningful interest in making sure that their rights were being respected by the factory owners. And because there was also a lack of transparency over which brand was supplied by which factory, there was very little in the way of outside pressure on the brands to do anything about this. If you could just turn to the next slide, please. These photos are important because they've helped explain how things changed. And unfortunately, since the Rana Plaza, there has been a huge amount of effort, to a large extent driven by the brands to improve conditions in the factories. But it really took Rana Plaza to make things happen. And that's because it was only after the factory collapsed and activists, including some of the union organizers who I knew, and journalists were able to go through the rubble that they could find out which brands were supplied by the Rana Plaza. And it was only then that these brands felt under any pressure to insist on and help fund improved conditions in Bangladeshi factories. So my question is, if the accident hadn't happened and the brands' names hadn't been disclosed, would they have felt compelled to do anything differently in Bangladesh? And are there not better ways of making the workers' concerns heard? Now, if you could turn to the next slide, please. We're shifting continent and shifting away from garments onto minerals, and I can see Emmanuel on my screen as well. And I'm just going to talk. Hey, Emmanuel, salut. I'm going to talk a bit about some work that Amnesty and AfriWatch, which is Emmanuel's organization, did together back in 2015. AfriWatch is a Congolese NGO which is based in Kinshasa and Lubumbashi, and our partners in research. And together we documented the human rights abuses linked to artisanal cobalt mining in the DRC. This is mining, for those who don't know, this is mining dug by hand. It's poorly regulated in the DRC or not regulated at all. It's very, very dangerous. Tunnels go down, up to 100 meters underground. There are frequent collapses. Many people die. We don't know how many, but accidents are commonplace. On the surface, many children work. We spoke to kids who were as young as 7, who instead of being at school spent all day working in difficult and dangerous conditions, picking up rocks on the ground, valuable rocks on the ground. And for everyone involved, men, women, and children, are very, very exposed to exploitation and don't believe they ever get a fair price in the kind of buying house that you can see in this photograph. This is simply a place where people come with sacks of cobalt to then sell, and from here it then enters the global market. But at a center like this, there are no questions asked. There's no transparency. There's no way for people further down the supply chain to know exactly where their cobalt has come from, because at places like this, there really is nowhere for there are, as I said, no questions asked, and no enforced transparency. And this, obviously then poses a different set of challenges to the scenario in Bangladesh, where there are those brands and there are the links between specific brands and specific factories. If you can go to the next slide, please. With our work and with our advocacy, we then were able to map where the cobalt goes to. There's a global supply chain. Much of it heads to China or other countries in Asia, where cobalt goes into batteries before then being supplied to tech or electric vehicle manufacturers around the world. And cobalt, of course, is an essential mineral for the global transition to clean energy, because it plays this important role in batteries and battery technology. When we approached various brands, and again, you can go to the next slide. I'm trying to speed up a bit here. I don't want to take up too much time. When we went to these major brands and we presented them with evidence that there was a risk that cobalt mined by children or mined by adults in these difficult and dangerous conditions was entering their supply chains, we really received very inadequate responses from the world leading tech and electric vehicle brands, as you can see here, whilst stating that they did respect human rights and require suppliers to respect human rights. They clearly weren't conducting adequate due diligence. So again, there's an issue of information not coming up the supply chain to the brands, and with that happening, this difficulty in holding them to account or being able to drive improvements on the ground. And that's the final slide, please. I want to sort of end my presentation with a few sort of concluding thoughts about our work on supply chains. What we've found is, if the problem with the Bangladeshi factories is that the voice of workers is not well heard or wasn't previously heard by the brands, with cobalt, after the initial problems where the government was denying that there were problems, that hasn't really been a challenge. The challenge has been the next steps. And here we've seen, once again, quite alarmingly, the voices of the poor communities who are forced by poverty to send their children into the mines. We've seen them ignored, or their voices not heard by the brands or the government. And And we've seen this in the way that the brands have responded to the campaigning that we launched, the media coverage that our campaign and the work of other organizations on this issue as well. So, for example, a number of brands that source cobalt have tried to make it look like they were acting responsibly by putting money into aid programs, supposedly to help these communities, but they put their money through foreign NGOs or non-profits which had little knowledge of conditions on the ground, and because they wanted to show their boards that they were doing something, because they wanted to put things in their sustainability reports, that year these projects were short-term, clearly not sustainable, and clearly not going to lead to effective change. Even worse than that, a number of the brands we exposed decided that rather than face the negative media coverage, they want to pull out of the DRC altogether and not be exposed to the risk of negative media coverage. So announced they were no longer going to be buying cobalt from the DRC. But this, this is clearly a highly irresponsible act in itself, because by not sourcing from the DRC, they are potentially making things much worse for the communities there by endangering the economy. And also by pulling out of the DRC, they're not engaging in those few pilot projects like the one photographed, which was set up by Trafigura. By not engaging in projects like that, they're actually undermining the efforts by those few companies that remain committed to the DRC and trying to help conditions on the ground. And all of this, and to wrap up, all of this just, I think, really does go to show how little the voices of the communities are heard. It is the 10th anniversary this year of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It is a good opportunity this year for us to re-examine them and look at what is it we can do to strengthen the role of businesses and make sure that businesses respect human rights. Amnesty International and other international NGOs and national NGOs have an important role to play in documenting abuses and standing up for the rights of communities, frontline communities and victims. But we can't do it all by ourselves. There's so much more that needs to be done to redress the balance. And I think it's great that this conference is asking these questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and hearing from others. Thanks.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. You've brilliantly raised some very pertinent thoughts and issues for our discussion. And I'm going to pass straight over now to Mathias Schluep, who's the Managing Director of the World Resources Forum Association, and in that role very much involved in developing multi-stakeholder networks, particularly around enhancing international cooperation on raw material policies. So Mathias, over to you. You've got a wonderful panel who are going to debate and discuss some of these issues. And I think you're also hoping to draw in comments through chat from our stakeholders online. So Mathias, over to you to develop the conversation.
Thank you very much, Peter. So thank you for giving me to manage this interesting panel. I have already multitasking with the chat on the side to hear what the audience is saying, with my mobile phone getting advices from the organizers, and of course listening to our panel members. It's a very interesting panel. I think we heard the challenges we have in responsible sourcing. Very interesting presentation by Mark, from actually hearing that the communities don't get access to the companies, they are not heard, to that probably they don't realize what's going on, or maybe working with the wrong partners together to actually kick off processes. So what we want to hear in this panel is, well, are there good examples where this is working? Or if not good examples, what are the lessons learned? What are the right approaches and strategies to assess these issues? So we already heard from Mark from Amnesty International. We will also have Ramon Balgasar from the Observatorio Plurinacional de Salares Andinos. It's a Chile-based organization that specializes in dialogue with local stakeholders dealing with environmental and social cultural issues. I'm sure that actually Ramon can address some of these issues quite well. Ramon has also developed several local projects on agroecology and environmental education in Atacama. In addition, he is a member of the Observatorio, as I already said, a collective of indigenous community members, activists and researchers from Chile, Argentina and Bolivia. Then we have Aidan Davey. He is COO of the International Council on Mining and Metals. Aidan has over 30 years of experience working on sustainable development issues, working with a range of private, multilateral and not-for-profit organizations. So we will also bring a vast amount of experience into this discussion. He leads the ICMM's work on environmental issues, including climate change, mine closure and water. And then we have Diego Marin, from the Global Policy Team at the European Environmental Bureau. Diego's focus is on environmental justice, indigenous rights, and the environmental and social impacts of the energy transition. He has spent time working on the ground in Peru, examining the links of extra activism on poverty in the region. So how I would like to do this panel is we have time around 40 minutes for discussion. I would like to kick off the discussion with very general questions, which I hopefully all of you will take time to answer. And then we will go into a little bit more detailed discussion afterwards. So I think the first thing is just to start up. What is the first step corporate social organization or company, as we heard, which doesn't always work, no, has to do when you flag problems raised by affected groups? We have heard it's not even, they're not heard, no? So what is the first step of a company? From your experience, maybe examples you say that has been done, or maybe what you think should be done. So I start with Aidan. Aidan, what would you add to this question?
Yeah, listen, thanks very much, Mathias. And I guess, look, first up is that we have a very strong belief as ICMM, and it's part of our membership proposition, that companies have to put in place local level mechanisms to address concerns and grievances. But let's also remember that I think those avenues of redress for concerns and grievances do not sit in isolation. It's really important that I think that they are part of very effective processes of engagement with local communities. And the hallmarks of effective engagement processes with local communities, as we all know, it's about being inclusive, it's about ensuring the ability to participate to groups that might ordinarily not necessarily have that ability to participate. But then I think that I guess a central dimension to many of those conversations may be that concerns get expressed by communities or by individuals within communities. And that, I think, is the purpose behind this concept of having in place effective local level grievance mechanisms. And they really provide a conduit or an avenue through which those issues of concern to communities can in the first instance be raised, but ultimately be addressed. And we've developed tools that support this kind of process, through guidance on grievance mechanisms. We first put it out in 2009. We put out an updated version last year. But other organizations have also done this, and I'm particularly fond of the work that the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman for IFC and NIGA have done in putting out really robust guidance on putting in place those local level grievance mechanisms, what works in practice, and some very good examples as well. And so those resources I've mentioned also include examples of how companies have done this well and the attributes that such mechanisms ought to embody.
Thank you, Aidan. Maybe I just switch over to Ramon. I see you're sitting comfortably outside, which I couldn't do. I have a pile of snow outside. It would be very cold. Welcome from Latin America, Ramon. From your point of view, you're working with the local community. Well, what is the first steps you would expect from a company to take to be inclusive, as actually Aidan says that they have guidance mechanism in place? So, what would, from your perspective, be the first step?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and good morning, everyone. One thing is that I think that essential thing is that all the voices are part of the actual decision-making process regarding extractive projects. That's to say, all the inhabitants and not only selected groups of people. And for this to be done correctly, we need to understand that behind the regulation of these activities, there are also private interests. So the regulation in countries like Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia probably, but in this case, I'm gonna speak about mostly about Chile. The regulation of mining activities, for example, in the case that most affects the Atacama salt flat, it's lithium and copper. And the regulation that is still in place, it's has its origin in the dictatorship of Pinochet. And we haven't been able to change that. So that's something that we need to understand. As a start, behind this regulation there are interests, and this regulation didn't show up like automatically. It's the product of a very complex and painful political process. So we need to understand this interest and also understand the limits of official knowledge, especially when it comes to ecosystems that are very complex, such as the Andean salt flats and wetlands. So on one side, we have this lack of regulation, we can call it like that. And on the other hand, we have the lack of knowledge, a lack of information. So we make decisions based on inefficient regulation and insufficient knowledge. Besides that, we take into consideration only very limited group of people's points of view. So there is no real participation. And when I say participation in the actual decision-making process, I mean not just hearing people, but also making them part of the decision-making process. That's to say, they have the right also to decide what can be done or not in their territory, and also to know what is the purpose of the extraction. For example, when we talk about lithium, we tend to think that lithium is a green mineral. Lithium is supposed to, supply the energy transition, but other minerals don't have the same purpose. So that's also very important, because we need to also understand that some minerals maybe are not necessary in this for our societies, especially during this crisis. We can also reflect on that. So I think that, yeah, we can have the participation. We can also take into consideration regulation, also the conditions, but also the purpose of the extraction.
Okay, thank you, Ramon. So I think we have a good understanding what we mean with inclusiveness, with inclusive processes here. I understand from you, Ramon, first steps would actually be to understand interests, so to make the right decision, and also understand the local knowledge. Diego, from a European perspective, would you also support that, or you also have experience from Peru? What is your experience? What would be the first steps?
Yes, of course. So hello, everyone. I completely agree with Ramon. In Peru, for example, the challenges are very similar. The 1993 constitution in the country, after Fujimori came into power, really gave more of more of an open ground for mining companies to come and exploit the land. And it really exacerbated not only biodiversity laws or conflicts in general, but really a sort of anti-indigenous sort of conflict within Lima, the capital, and also the rest of the country. The country is very, very centralized. So what Lima says really is what happens. So what this does is it creates a sort of extra burden on already marginalized peoples, people who are suffering from environmental racism as well. You know, and it really puts it into a situation in which the aggravations only start to increase. There is, of course, a historical background within that, a colonialist perspective as well, that unfortunately has not ended. And in that sense, when I was working with communities in Cajamarca in northern Peru, and the largest gold mine in the world, actually, in Latin America, and the largest gold mine in Latin America, one of the biggest concerns there was the lack of access to companies and also politicians. What happened there is communities really feel sort of very, very much powerless because they cannot contact their congressmen because or local leaders because they are already either corrupted by the mining companies, and they unfortunately cannot contact the mining companies because they either don't give them that information or they're just inaccessible. And actually, in a European context, sort of to sort of connect the dots, I guess, because when it comes to extractive issues, we see a lot of similarities, regardless of the place that this happens. And when I've been talking to community representatives here in a European context, you see a lot of the frustrations within these communities is the lack of information that they have, or the lack of access to the local politicians as well as mining operations. And this sort of creates another pressure for them, right? Aside from the fact that they're already feeling the burden or just existential threat of a mining company happening, a lot of these people want to know exactly what's going on. How can I access that information? What to expect? So I think it is important as a first step to really explain to the people what's going on the ground. A lot of people just don't know. And the NGOs, of course, have a role to play here, but sort of building alliances and, in a sense, sending these voices to the policymakers, so that a difference can be made.
Okay, thank you, Diego. So actually, that brings us back to an issue Mark has presented at the beginning in the introductory presentation. So the communities cannot make themselves heard, or they actually don't know. Also, like Ramon said, they don't have the knowledge what's going on. Mark, also in your cases, you mentioned in your presentation, I mean, would legislation, was that always an issue in that cases? And maybe also from you, could you name a good example where actually something really worked?
Thanks, Mathias. Yeah, I mean, I just first of all want to echo what all the other panelists have said, and I support and all of their suggestions and ideas. I mean, we've seen them in so many other contexts around the world, these similar issues and the need for grievance mechanisms, access to information, etc. I mean, sure, we can't talk about these issues without also looking at the failure of states to regulate, whether that's in the host states where these mining operations take place. It's a failure of regulation, the failure to enforce regulations, to insist on sort of meaningful community consultations when these projects are planned, et cetera, you know, through to the failure of the home states of these corporations, the failure of, you know, the legal systems in either location to hold them accountable. I mean, what we've seen with Shell, for example, which is you know, a well-known case, is that, you know, communities have had no luck over the past 30, 40 years in their attempts to hold Shell accountable in Nigerian courts. Cases there go on for decades. You know, I met one man who had been trying to sue Shell for 20 years, and his lawyer had passed away during this time. It had taken so long. You know, and at the same time, the communities struggle to take Shell to court in the UK or the Netherlands. That could be changing. I mean, there are some high-profile cases at the moment, that one in the Netherlands and one in the UK, which was heard by the UK Supreme Court earlier in the middle of last year, where an appeal was heard. That opens the possibility, that and the previous case relating to Vedanta in Zambia, you know, opens the possibility that communities will be able to take companies to court here, but there are so many obstacles to them doing so, not least, you know, the practical barriers, the cost, the difficulty of accessing information that can be used in these cases, you know, let alone the arguments that parent companies can't be or shouldn't be held responsible or liable for the actions of their subsidiaries. So, you know, whenever Amnesty makes, and our, you know, obviously all partner NGOs as well, when we make recommendations, when we identify a problem such as cobalt mining in the DRC or you know, Shell in Nigeria, we make recommendations not just for companies but also for governments and regulators. And you know, we want to see improved regulation. We want to see companies. Well, we want to see improved regulation. We want to see the governments of home state bring in regulations such as we've seen in France with its duty of vigilance law. There's this proposed regulation at the moment in the EU introducing mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. You know, we believe that these are necessary laws holding companies to account for the environmental and human rights impacts of their operations wherever they are in the world. And so a recommendation for businesses then is that they should support this regulation, which would provide an even playing field. It shouldn't be left to one or two, you know, good actors to conduct due diligence to an international standard. It should be in their interest to make sure that all companies, their competitors, do the same as them.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Aidan, you talked about your guidance. I think there has been done a lot of work also on the table, no, to develop guidance, which actually should help that the communities get heard, get involved, that we can follow inclusive processes, that we have in the decision-making process all the voices heard, as Ramon says. So, could you point out where this actually was implemented? So to say this is like a flagship case where others could orient themselves. This is a good example.
So I think that, you know, that there are so many dimensions to this conversation already, and setting aside the fact that we're getting into a level of detail that is kind of, if you like, one strand of a responsible sourcing conversation. But I think it's a really important one. Because when we talk about you know, responsible sourcing, which is the entry point for this panel today, that's kind of the language that we use. But actually, when you get down to the community level, you know, communities aren't particularly interested in having a conversation about responsible sourcing. They want to have a conversation about, you know, whether or not a project does indeed take place. And I think that was raised by both Ramon and Diego. And then if it is going to take place, the conditions under which it does take place. And so I think both in terms of you know, engagement with communities around the conditions under which resource development should take place, and that's both in indigenous communities and in non-indigenous communities. I think we do see good examples of engagement processes that have respected the attributes and the principles associated with free, prior, and informed consent, for example. And if I think of you know one specific example of that I managed to observe up close and personal was in the case of the Diavik diamond mine in the Canadian Northwestern Territories. But equally, I think when it then comes to the examples of companies that have done an incredibly good job of engaging with communities in an inclusive and participatory way, I think there are kind of lots of specific examples there that I can point to as well. Similarly, I would say when it comes to the rolling out of effective grievance mechanisms that truly respect those processes of inclusivity, of accessibility, of and I'm struggling to remember the other attributes that were conveyed through the UN Guiding Principles process that John Ruggie so capably led on. So I think again, I would point people to those guidance documents, to the numerous case studies that are buried within there, rather than going into lots of individual vignettes, because I think it's the weight of the evidence that comes through from lots of examples that's really valuable. But I guess when we come back to the question of responsible sourcing, I do think there is a big question mark in my mind about the extent to which local communities really want to be a part of that conversation, or the extent to which they are much, much more interested in that almost the bilateral conversation that takes place between them and the company once the project has been approved and is under development, which is, I think, where where I think is a fertile ground for the discussion today.
Actually, that's interesting. You say you really need to also to understand who from the communities want to be heard. Ramon, you said that every single voice needs to be heard, but other voices from your experience, they don't really want to be heard, or if that expression arises, is just maybe a lack of information getting to these communities.
Yeah. Well, I think that actually clarification of my involvement in mining issues is not exactly promoting dialogue, because we think that for dialogue to exist, you need equal power conditions. So unless we can ensure equal power conditions, we cannot talk about dialogue. We can talk about negotiations, or maybe, I don't know, agreements between companies and communities. Okay, so I would love to see the possibility of dialogue, but I don't. Okay, I wish that exists. Sometimes, and I think that this is also very important, communities, local communities, not only indigenous, rural or urban communities, sometimes they don't want mining projects in their territories. So I was keeping that for the discussion, but maybe it would be interesting, since Aidan suggested that we take into consideration the fact that the right to say no has also to be respected. Not all communities want mining projects in their territories. Not all communities want extraction. Most of the times, actually, what they do is to deal with projects that already exist, or the projects that they think they are not really able, actually, to stop. It's the case in Chile. It's the case in Atacama Salt Flat, where, for example, lithium mines exist there since the dictatorship, actually. And the copper mines that are in the same territory and that share the water with lithium projects, for example, they exist before the indigenous law was issued in the country. So the communities there, they cannot really stop this project. So when you talk with them, they say, what else can we do? And then the other thing is that I was saying before, sometimes only selected groups of people are part of dialogue or part of negotiations with these companies. So most of the population is actually left behind anyway. And that creates a lot of divisions, a lot of internal conflicts. So after the projects actually close, communities are left with a lot of internal conflicts, divisions that cannot really be solved with reparations or with remediation. So I think that maybe that's why I was talking about complexity. I think that reducing these issues to companies, communities, governments isn't enough. I think we need to go a little bit further and understand the social dimension of extraction as well. In order to this to be done, we need, again, we need to take all the voices into consideration, but not just to know their opinions, also to make them part of the decision-making process and respecting the right to say yes or no.
Thank you, Ramon. Diego, you wanted to add something to this discussion?
Yes, of course. I think one of the things that we need to understand is that you're right. The right to say no is absolutely necessary. And there is a concern, obviously, of poor application of free, prior, and informed consent. The misunderstanding that consulting communities is enough to gain their social license to operate, for example. And that in itself could be very contentious, right? Obviously, communities will lose the faith in the process if they're already at the negotiating table and the decision has already been made. And often these decisions are already made, in a sense, through the national governments who already label a project of national interest, for example, and the municipal community, the municipal government, for example, has no real strength in opposing that. So these are sort of these challenges within the government system itself. On top of that, there is also the issue of that that companies, for example, might give the argument that jobs will be created and there is a development opportunities for the area. For example, in the case of Northern Portugal, this argument is really being sold, right? That these jobs will be created, so therefore we need to open up the land for lithium mining. But then communities already there are trying to stand up. Of course, COVID did pose challenges for them, but they are. I mean, they're agricultural communities, peasant communities that are already working. They have a livelihood there, and it's a threat. So this type of idea of the right to say no is absolutely needed. I mean, effective engagement. This is the kind of thing that we need to ask. What is effective engagement if the result, the end goal, is different for the parties involved? So if a community doesn't want a project by any means, effective engagement would then be for the company and the governments as well to respect the fact that a community doesn't want it, and not to push or divide communities, which tends to happen in these sort of encounters. So it is very necessary to, like Ramon said, to really involve communities and to really listen to their voices, and not expecting necessarily to change their mind, but really to listen to the existential threats that they could have. Nobody wants to move from the land that they're extremely attached to, that have historical and cultural ties to, and this psychological issues that entails, right? So it's very good if the first step, I would say, to avoid bigger conflicts is to truly respect the decisions for self-determination of the communities that are going to be the most affected. And if there is any truth to leaving no one behind, then this starts with the right to say no.
It's interesting, becoming very strong in this conversation, the right to say no. Now, I ask myself, is this wishful thinking, or is it actually, is there a chance that we can go that way? I don't know, Mark, from your work with Amnesty International, have you seen any example where you say this concept, the right to say no, has been respected?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think from the cases where I've studied, and actually, you know, I think interested to hear from Ramon here, actually, and the experience of, you know, Latin America and lithium mining in particular, where I know that there are, you know, communities, I think particularly in Argentina, you know, who are sort of resisting. They're seeing what's happened in Chile and are resisting, you know, lithium mining expanding or starting, but near them. But more broadly, no. I mean, I think the cases, maybe it's just the nature of the work we do. The cases we study and the cases we hear about are ones where extraction has already started, and communities are raising protests. I would say, you know, I think it is quite unusual from what I know. So this is just anecdotal, really. Can't pretend to make a serious claim about this, but from what I've encountered, there are always, you know, communities are divided on these issues. It's very difficult or very unusual to have a community, you know, all agreeing. And I think the danger we have there, as Diego was just saying, is that these splits are then often exacerbated by how companies respond to them or talk to them or treat them, perhaps favoring certain members of the community over others, talking to some members of the community rather than to everyone. So I suppose the nature of my work is to come across instances where these problems already exist, frankly, rather than those examples where communities have spoken with one voice. Yeah, but as I said, maybe I'm looking at Ramon. I'm thinking that maybe Ramon's got some examples, or maybe not.
Is Ramon?
Yeah, I'm sharing. Well, it's in Spanish. Sorry. Well, sorry. It's in Spanish, but Google can do that for you. It's a recent article on how SQM is trying to win local communities. So I think this is a good example. At some point, in San Pedro de Atacama, there are about 21 indigenous communities officially recognized by the state of Chile, among which 18 are congregated in an association called Council of Atacameño Communities, Peoples. So these all these communities at some point decided not to accept the conditions provided by SQM to respond to a case of serious environmental damage that could lead this company to lose the environmental license. Okay, I'm trying to be very simple in this. So after a couple of months, one community accepted the agreement offered by the company. A very big amount of money, like 1,700,000 millions of pesos in dollars. I don't know, like right now, but a very big amount of money. So then people can say, okay, so communities are not in the same position. One community decided to accept these conditions, other communities don't. Now in this article, it is said that so far 3 communities accepted the conditions offered by this company. But again, is this dialogue? Are people free to decide if this company can stay or not in the territory? So it's very hard to analyze this, because it's not only complex within the communities, but at the national level, actually, we know how powerful these companies are. So if we really want to know what people think or what is their position, I would say that 99% of people are against mining companies, are against extractivism. Another question is if these people are willing to resist extractivism. If these people or these communities are willing to say no, because they know that probably that wouldn't take them like anywhere, going against these kind of companies like SQM. This is maybe the best example in Chile, because it's also involved in very big corruption cases, financing political campaigns of the current president and the former. So we cannot generalize, but this is a good example. I think that what's going on in Chile, Diego can tell if it's maybe similar in Peru. It probably is, because it is in Argentina. And yeah, we cannot generalize. People don't have the same opinion, or they don't decide to follow the same strategies, but we cannot simplify their decisions or their points of view just because they accept these kind of agreements. I wouldn't tell that the community members that accept these agreements are in favor of mining or lithium mining whatsoever. I think we need to go a little bit further, and maybe this is one interesting step to share these very different points of view in this space, right? But yeah, but there are many more voices, and maybe that's the challenge: how to hear, how to understand, deeply understand those voices.
Mathias, maybe if I could,
yes,
maybe
sure,
just
Aidan,
come in this,
please go ahead.
Partly at the risk of there being violent agreement amongst all of the panelists, I maybe put in a slightly contradictory note, and that is, so I completely agree, Ramon, you're right, and Mark, the notion that communities are completely homogenous in terms of their attitudes and mindsets towards mining or any other form of development that might take place in their backyard is mistaken. However, equally, I think the notion that there always ought to be the ability for communities to say no, to express their free, prior, and informed consent in the context of individual projects, I think that should also be challenged. So personally and institutionally as ICMM, we absolutely believe that to be the case in situations where mining takes place on indigenous lands or territories. There ought to be the ability for free, prior, and informed consent on behalf of the host communities. But should that be the case for all mining developments? I'm less convinced. And I'm less convinced in part because, ultimately, countries, the state in many countries takes ownership of the subsurface resources in the interests of the broader citizenry, and says that we will look to develop those resources in support of the broader citizenry. And so to some extent, there is an element of strategic planning that must come into play here when it comes to decisions around resource developments outside of indigenous lands and territories. Having said that, I think one of the reasons why Diego and Ramon have the concerns that they've expressed here about the interests and the rights of communities not being respected in that process is that in too many instances, the states give an in-principle commitment to development taking place in areas that are either extraordinarily environmentally sensitive or socially sensitive. And that then puts companies in the invidious position of having to try and navigate that difficult territory, secure in the knowledge that if they do not navigate that successfully, there will be a procession of companies that are prepared to come in behind them and to do that project. And that's a really difficult situation. And just to be really kind of specific, because I know that Peru is something that Diego knows very well and Ramon knows very well, to give two examples of very different projects in different parts of the country and different mindsets from the host communities. If you look at the Cerro Verde project down near Arequipa in the south of the country, in the not too distant past, Cerro Verde went through a major expansion, and it went through that major expansion with the very strong support of the host community that expansion should take place. Go to a different part of the country around Cajamarca, the Minas Conga project, which is Newmont and Buenaventura. In that situation, Newmont have publicly declared we will not develop that project without the explicit support of the host communities. So I think I think it's not as straightforward perhaps as there always ought to be a right to say no, or there should never be a right to say no.
Thank you, Aidan. That's interesting. Actually brings us back to something we discussed at the beginning. We talk about community involvement. In the end, it's still connected to regulations which maybe go to a past time of the country, which were not updated to modern times, or the process was too difficult to update them. So that is of course a quite big issue. I just also want to mention to the audience, there is a possibility that you raise also your voice, or you add some questions in the chat to the panelists. It's actually the time now. I have here one question brought forward by Daniel Novak, and he wants to know, and I think it's an interesting question now to hear, you know, the thin line between lobbying, influencing opinions, or letting actually not trying to influence opinions of the local community. There could be a role of intermediates, no, in this whole communication, CSO, an NGO, etc. So what would be the role of such a intermediate? Maybe first back to you, Aidan. I think you have also with your members, you maybe have made this experience already.
I guess I make a distinction between the role of intermediaries when it comes to the engagement with host communities and the role of intermediaries in situations of conflict or grievance resolution. In the first situation, I don't really think there is a role for intermediaries in terms of you know, the building and the fostering of constructive relationships between companies and host communities. It shouldn't be outsourced. It ought to be something where the company has both effective capacity and the mandate from those people that engage and interact with host communities to do so honestly and to do so effectively. However, I think it's a rather different matter when it comes to the local level resolution of grievances. And again, I make a very clear distinction between local level resolution of grievances as opposed to the judicial or indeed the extraterritorial mechanisms for resolution that Mark has touched upon. At that very local level, I think there can often be great value in having a third party or an intermediary be a neutral or honest broker, particularly in situations where you have intractable or protracted differences of opinion or conflict. And I guess this is informed by my previous professional life before joining ICMM. I mentioned the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman for the International Finance Corporation in MIGA. That is an office within the World Bank that serves as an avenue of recourse and redress for communities that feel they have been disadvantaged by investments by either the IFC or MIGA. And I used to work for that office back in the mid-1990s. And I think, you know, then and still today, it plays a very powerful role in occupying that intermediary space and being able to bring a kind of neutral perspective to bear to try and resolve difficult conflicts.
What's the other's opinion who actually are maybe closer to also such roles? I mean, Ramon, I understand you're not really convening the communication with the communities, but what do you think of this role of a CSO, an organization, an NGO in this play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like as Mark said about this different perspective within communities, I think that CSOs, civil society in general, can also have different political positions regarding extraction, indigenous rights, and sustainability. So we all have our, we are, I don't know, like we are responsible for what we do. Some have a lot of influence. We are, for example, a collective that was born in San Pedro de Atacama, and we are people, all people, very different people actually, who met through the defense of Andean salt flats. Sometimes international organizations have much more influence and power to get to the policymakers or to through the supply chain, for example, power that we don't have. So I think that it's also very important to understand that where are we and from where we have or build our opinions and decide to work. I think that in the case of Chile, very particular case of Atacama, most of the indigenous communities have the conditions to defend their positions by themselves, especially in the last 5 years. I don't think they really need anybody to speak for them. But sometimes in other places, for example, you know that lithium mining is expanding very fast in the region, and not only there. There are also projects in Spain, in Portugal, in Serbia, in Quebec, in Canada, for example. But in Latin America, in the lithium triangle, as it's called, there are new projects, and sometimes the communities don't have access to information. They are not really prepared to face these issues. They don't have support from the government or from any NGO or organization, civil society organization. So in that case, we, for example, what we do is we go there, we establish contact, dialogue among us. We try to share our experience. We try to show them this side of the story so they can make decisions with more information. But that is not going to change the structural conditions, unfortunately. So I think that at the local level, even us, we have a very limited field for action. But some organizations, I think that have much better conditions to, for example, to influence the value chain and to influence the industry. Also to maybe to show or to reflect on the purpose of mining. Maybe I said this before, but I think it's very important. Why are we still mining gold, for example? What is it for? Why are, I think this is important. It's not just a detail. We cannot keep mining eternally and keeping like continuous growth, and for what? So I think that organizations can act at different level and also on different aspects of this issue. This is a very complex issue, of course, and of course we cannot talk about everything here. But I think it's good to know that this issue is not just about dialogue between communities and companies. I think we need to take into consideration more elements.
Mathias, you're on mute.
Sorry, still making this mistake after 1 year of telephone conferences. Okay, so actually now that brings us to an interesting question by Masuma. The question of the role of the government, back to that, and she writes, following up on what Aidan referred to, how do Ramon and Diego, so I asked this Diego, actually view the role of their governments in saying yes to projects without consultation with their communities?
So if I understand the question correctly, is if the government were to pursue a project without the consent of the communities? Is that what the question is?
I mean, what Aidan said is actually that licenses or the strategy to actually explore certain areas for resources is already made and commitments are already given, but actually without consulting with the community. So how do you see that? How do you address that?
Yeah, of course. So this in itself is I mean, in a situation like that, you're basically looking for to create trouble, really, because this sort of situations, what's happened, Aidan actually brought this up with stopping the project, the Newmont project in Conga Valley and in Conga, the Conga project in Cajamarca, that resulted, for example, through the deaths of 4 community members. This was a serious fight that was just currently happening in the area, and the government had actually agreed for the project to go on. Had the previous Umpula was he was the president back then, he actually said that we're not gonna sell the water of the country. Water is worth more than gold. 2 years later, he backtracks. He decides that he should, in fact, pursue the already commodity spike of gold, and we should expand the Yanacocha project. And people were already fighting against it, and for years they were fighting against it, and eventually it led to the death, unfortunately, of 4 people. And now, when you also mentioned that aid in Arequipa, I think you're talking about Valle del Tambo. In that area, actually, there was indeed protests going on. People were really mobilizing, mainly because that area was one of the most fertile lands in all of Peru, and where Lima receives a lot of its food sources. So, but it may have not been Valle del Tambo, because I see you nodded your head. Okay, perfect. Okay, because yes, there's a lot of different projects and can't keep up with all of them. But generally speaking, I mean, if the government and this is the thing, though, because now governments will be more pressured to seek renewable energy sources to move toward a low carbon future, while communities that are largely agricultural, biodiversity areas will bear the brunt of this energy transition, right? We're not going to see development projects in Paris. We're not going to see them in Brussels. We're not going to see them in Madrid. These are going to happen in agricultural areas, areas that are sparsely populated generally, where people have been living a certain way for many generations. And why would we not have these projects in Berlin or Madrid? Well, because that would be inconceivable. We couldn't ever risk these cultural heritage of our wonderful cities, really, right? But the people that live in these areas, their mountains, their rivers, their forests, they have that cultural attachment, just like we do to the Eiffel Tower, for example. So this type of cultural attachment needs not be neglected. And if it is through the pressure of reaching a low carbon future, then we're asking for trouble. At the end of the day, the world is facing 2 major crises: the crises of the climate crisis and the crisis of inequality. So this energy transition cannot, absolutely not, pretend to solve one crisis while enhancing another. So it's something that we really need to be mindful of.
Okay, thank you, Diego. I think time is almost up for the discussion. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion, mindful comments. For me, it was quite interesting. We started with a question how to engage the local community, how to communicate with them. We pretty fast learned that actually much more complex than just putting up a dialogue between a company and a community. It has something to do with the legal framework. It has something to do with many other stakeholders. It also has something to do with accepting actually what you say, the right to say no. Also the complexity of actually the thin line between maybe the right of somebody to give arguments why maybe somebody should accept something, or why it's a positive effect on him, and that actually you should not try to influence local opinion. So I think that was quite interesting, and we will have now an example presentation about an example, and I think for this I give back to Peter for the introduction of the presentation. Peter.
Mathias, thank you very much. And a fascinating discussion between your panelists. It certainly shows that the deeper you dig into these issues, the layers of complexity there are. And I was very struck by a comment at the towards the end that Sumac was making, in a sense, an advocate for circular economy, is that we are very bad at our resource use and lack of reuse. And maybe we are in this ugly transition phase of having to somehow extract more resources, but we need to put huge energy into how we can either create a circular economy, and as part of that, substitute some of those minerals in grounds, many grounds of which are sacred grounds to indigenous people. So interesting hope for the far future, but we are where we are in a a highly complex area. So brilliant. Thank you very much to the panel for raising issues. What we wanted to do was just offer a further insight on this. And I'm delighted that we're joined by Emmanuel Umpula, who's Executive Director of AfriWatch. Emmanuel, great to have you with us. AfriWatch is an NGO based in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but working all over Africa with a mission to promote just and equitable exploitation of natural resources in Africa and holding states and companies accountable. So in that work, you have some direct and clear insights, and I guess some very clear messages to feed into our resourcing journey. So Umpula, great to have you with us and very interested to hear your take on this critical issue.
Thank you very much, Peter, and to having me for this good discussion on what we are doing as NGOs to help communities and companies. Yeah, so I will give just some example and just to complete what Mark has said, because we have been working with Mark for a long time. And so I will just complete what he said. So please, next slide, please. So as AfriWatch, what our objectives are, sorry, I'm just, the first objective is to increase citizen participation through the availability of information to all state and non-state actors accountable for their actions and to suggest alternative change. So I had, since we started today, we can't have a good participation of communities or citizens if they don't have a good information. So that's a good state. Yeah, so next step, please. Yes, as AfriWatch, we work across Africa, and we are interested in mining and oil, more specifically. But most of the time, our work is based in DRC, but we act everywhere. We don't have an office everywhere, but the main office is in Congo. Yeah. So next step, please. Yes. What are the challenges when we are working? When you have mining companies which come in Congo or everywhere in Africa, the first problem is that we have the problem of forced eviction of local communities. We have the problem of corruption, and during the allocation process of transfer, mining licensing or right or assets. So most of the time we have a case of corruption. And the third problem or challenge is poverty. Yeah, if you go everywhere, you find that there are many problems. If I heard what you said just since we begin, but you didn't touch a problem of poverty. How we deal with this problem? Even we can have a good process of traceability of minerals without taking into account the problem of poverty. That will remain a big problem. So we need to look at that when we are thinking about standards and everything. So we need to look at that. And we have the other problem is poor performance of state-owned companies. I believe in private companies, but my idea, and there is a research which shows that if in a country you don't have a state-owned companies which is good, well-running, that you will not getting money or profit from your minerals. So that's a key point to look at. The other challenges is environmental pollution. Yeah, there is a lot of cases, and we've just sent a letter to UN Child Rights last month against children who are empoisoning by lead in Zambia, Kabwe. So, and in Congo, we have a lot of problem with that. And the other problem is less extractive sector contribution to the budget. If you try to see where private companies are working and where the state is weak, the contribution to the budget is low. So that's another problem, because you can't fight poverty when mining companies are not contributing to the budget. And yeah, and the last one, I think just a list is not limited. Conflict between artisanal mining and large companies, miners and large companies is a huge problem. Yeah, next slide, please. And key actions as AfriWatch, what we are doing. So we are trying to provide alternative proposition to participate to legal reform, notably mining codes and hydrocarbon codes. So for example, in DRC, we played as AfriWatch a huge role to propose alternative to improve the mining code in 2018. And the other one, empowering communities. Now we are working in more than 10 communities to empower them, because for us, you talk more about how communities can talk to large companies. So how can they then talk to companies if they are not capacitated, they don't have any means to defend themselves? So we think it's a key problem, it's a key action, and we are working to empower them. Extractive industry revenue management, it's a good problem also from that, and we work to help the state to manage revenues coming for industry, extractive industry. The other problem, we have a campaign on anti-corruption. The campaign, the name is DRC is not for sale. So if you go to our website, you will see what we are doing. We are fighting corruption on that. And also, we are supporting EITI with publication of contract and also the management of state-owned companies. As I said, if we need to get profit from our minerals, we need to have strong national companies. Yeah, so we are fighting for that, and we have a lot of activity on that. Yeah, please, next slide. So a group, affected group, we have workers, and local communities, and if you go local communities, we have women and children. And in 2018, we published with Rights and Accountability in Development Board, 19, sorry, and we tried to make a link between corruption and poverty, and how corruption can affect workers in a company. So we have the case of Metalcom. It's a good report. You can, it's in English, and we can share that report. So we know that communities also, local communities are affected. Yeah, please, next step. What mean of action, what we do action research. So we have a lot of research reports publishing on corruption, on management of state-owned companies, and yeah, so, and also the analysis of legal framework. And we do advocacy, towards officials. And the last one is we do legal and no judicial support for local communities. So we support them to lodge complaint against companies, but we support them also to claim their rights. Yeah, next, please. Yeah, so that's what we are doing as AfriWatch, and we are ready to share what we are doing as NGOs working in Africa. And so I will end by saying that when we are talking about standards and everything, we should take in account poverty, because if we don't have any strategy to fight poverty, even if we have good standards, they will not end the problem on the ground. Thank you very much.
Emmanuel, thank you very much indeed. And you're obviously doing very interesting and very important work there. Can I just ask you, I would like to ask you a question, and then I'm going to come back to all our panelists in the earlier discussion. Really, if there was one hard-hitting, original, interesting message that will provide fuel to the resourcing discussion that we're having, particularly around that connection with local communities directly affected. But before I come to the rest of the panel, I just wonder, Emmanuel, I mean, overall, I'm sure you have a cheery disposition, but are you feeling you are losing an impossible battle? And in a sense, the forces of extraction are just so great. And in a sense, the abuses are widespread and enormous. Or are you sensing a genuine traction and real possibilities of conversation, of dialogue, of mutual value, just as you look across all the areas you're involved? What's that outlook for you?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, which is very important. I'm not sure we are losing the battle. I'm not sure we are fighting to get. But I think the problem is, what I was saying is that we need to work on that. And the key problem we have is that we have communities who are not informed. They are not have enough knowledge to defend themselves. So the work we are doing as AfriWatch is to empower them. And we see where we are working with communities, we are seeing a lot of changes in terms of, because communities are able now to defend themselves. So I think I'm not sure we are losing, but we are trying to change and to make big companies to understand the message. I can take an example. Amnesty and AfriWatch published a report in 2016. And when we talk about child labor, what big companies understood was, we need to make a traceability mechanism. They don't talk about poverty. So we need to make them understand the problem on the ground. Yeah, so if they don't understand what the problem, they can give bad solutions. So for us as AfriWatch, we need to take resources to use them in a good manner, notably to help local communities. Because if you try to see what companies are doing, they are putting a lot of money in audit, in everything, but they are not using enough money to really help local communities on the ground. So the fight now is about the justice. How can we share the profits coming from the mining, from extractive activities? We don't have anything against auditors cabinets, but we are asking companies not to use a lot of money to give to these big audit cabinets, but to use this money to help the people who are in need.
Right. Okay, that's a very powerful message. Thank you very much indeed for that. And because money is, as they say, the saying, in one sense, it's the root of all evils, but it is also a way forward for communities. So what I'm hearing for you is that it's the thoughtful use of the money resource to support communities. And if you look at that counterbalanced with the amount of money spent on auditing processes and all the rest of it, what we really need to do is to help get resources directly into the hands of communities that are fighting for their survival often, and particularly with the challenge of climate change, that fight gets no easier. So thank you very much for that. Just in a few moments, we've got, and I'm going to take that as a kind of key message from you, just because we have the technology, but it also gives us an opportunity. I'm quite keen just to get a final message from this discussion from all our panelists, and Constanza is going to bravely try and write it up on these amazing post-its. I think we got our first one from Emmanuel. So Constanza, you may just want to write that up. I'm going to paraphrase, but Emmanuel, you may want to say something different. And I really want just sort of sound bites, but I think it's having a real focus on the alleviation of poverty in using financial resources. And I would say, and this takes wisdom. Is that reasonable, Emmanuel, as a start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. This is going to have to be quick fire because we've only got 4 or 5 minutes. But Diego, I'm going to come to next to you. If you had a message that you'd really like to hit home to everyone listening in, and for the resourcing conference around this issue, what would your parting shot be?
I would say that when dealing with community, engaging with communities in general, speaking with them, from the industry side and the government side, there needs to be a sense of empathy. Within these talks, there's a lot of emotions going around, and I think there's a big push by the industry and the government side to put on concrete data, hard data. This is how many jobs are going to be created. This is how much wealth is going to create for the region. And people need to be connected on a human level. So empathy is key when dealing with these situations, right. So that we create better connections and just overall better communication. Right.
Beautiful. I love that. And that's a creative thought. I sometimes use the word curiosity as well. Sometimes, oh, well, what can we do to them, pay them off? But actually understanding the situation you're going into and having that empathy and that curiosity to learn sometimes means we can get elegant possible solutions. Okay. Ramon, are you still with us? Or I think you may have a
I am.
Oh, okay. If there was a key message coming from yourself to nourish our discussion.
Yeah, maybe 3 elements. One is transparency. That's to say 0 tolerance to corruption throughout the whole value chain. Second, independent and sufficient knowledge from the complexity. And the third would be the right to say no.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was following what Constanza's written down there. Your second one, can you just repeat that one? Yeah.
Yes. The second one would be independent and sufficient knowledge.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And in a world where facts and knowledge seem to be negotiable, maybe that's a very important one. If we have a shared understanding of a reality and the true facts, we can then have the conversation. Thank you very much indeed for that. If I move to you now, Aidan.
Yeah, I guess it might be to try and find a means of bridging the disconnect between the local level concerns of communities as opposed to the language around responsible sourcing that prevails in conversations like the resourcing discussion. Those are quite different. And so I think there are points of connection, but ultimately I think the language that is used for much of the discussion about responsible sourcing is a rather exclusive language, and it needs to be made much more tangible and real for communities to express, to connect into their felt concerns.
And is that just language, or is there a more fundamental mindset disconnect? I'm just interested if we were more thoughtful with the language, we'd find we have more in common for conversation?
So I think we have more in common for conversation, but, and I've tried to point to that because I think there is a strong intersection, but I think the difficulty is that the framing language around responsible sourcing debates are often so abstracted from the on-the-ground realities and concerns of local communities.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. And Mark, you started off our conversation and with some hard-hitting information and examples from what you've heard. If you had one parting thought to resource our ongoing conversation, what would that be, Mark?
Thanks, Peter. I think it would be that businesses need to treat activists, human rights defenders, trade unionists, whoever it is, as allies rather than opponents. Even when, or maybe particularly when they're asking difficult questions.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, those were actually 5 unexpected but really powerful final interventions. So could I thank you all as panelists, and for Mathias for moderating the conversation before you. I wish you again all well in your ongoing endeavors within this arena. Again, among our participants out there, if you have a key message that you think emerges from, or you want to feed into this discussion, please add it into the chat over the break we're coming up to, because we're going to be looking very carefully at everything that's been recorded and written down. So if you have a key message reinforcing something or something you think that's been missed, then it would be really great to hear from you. After the break, we're going to be looking at very much from the point of view of industry frontrunners and alliances. There are industries who are trying to work out what the right thing to do is and how to do it in a complex world. We're going to hear from some of those and test out whether we are beginning to build some of those thoughtful, maybe even empathetic alliances and relationships, or whether are we still floating on the surface of what can we get away with. Come back after the break. I think we're going to start again, if I have a look at my little chart, we're going to start at 4:05. So there's a chance to grab a cup of whatever you are locally inclined to at this time of the day, and we'll see you back at 4:05 European time. Thanks very much indeed. What a great session. See you shortly.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.